All right, everybody, we should be all sliding in over here. I will bring our guests, our panelists back up, and then folks wanting to raise questions, if you want, you can either let me know in the chat or request to be brought up on screen. Otherwise, we'll just read your questions as best we can. Let's see. Let me find. Let me just ask, you know what? Let me just ask our panelists to say something in the chat so I can find you more easily and bring you up. Hey, Tia Moya, thanks for coming through and sticking to the second hour. Yeah, you know what, Mjiba, would you? I can't find your name in here. Could you say something in the chat, and then I can? And same thing with you, Brother Kwasi. For some reason, I was only able to find Iyelli.
There's a search bar. It should be under people. When you click on people, you can add.
Yeah, but sometimes, yeah, there he is. Okay, sometimes, oh, he's not live yet. Kwasi why is Kwasi not here?
Sure. Todd asked to be put on for a second.
Okay, hold on a second. Let's see. Put me on, Todd. There you go. Mjiba's not here either for some reason. All right, let's see. Dr. Burroughs, you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
I can. We'll have to suffer through your disembodied voice.
I know. I'm going to have to work on these video settings here. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed yesterday's. Wow, it wasn't that long. I really enjoyed the last hour discussion. I'm assuming we're going to go into more where I think we were starting to get to, which is a discussion of world democracy, because I know each country sets up its own system of citizenship and responsibility and what those rights are. And I think that's looks like that's where we were headed. So I hope we're still going to be headed there. That's all I wanted to say.
All right, very good. I have reached back out because I think we're having some confusion with and the other thing that I'm noticing, for some reason, the questions didn't come over to this. Aha, that might be another issue we didn't fully figure out.
Dr. Iyelli has most of those questions.
Yeah, Todd emailed the questions.
Oh, okay, good. I don't see them, but
now, Dr. Ball, you can let me out. You can let me out and let the other panelists in.
Okay. Do you, Dr. Ichile, do you have the questions?
I'm gonna send them to you right now.
All right. If you want to just let's see.
Yeah, I can ask a few.
Yeah, if you like, if you have them.
Oh, these are really good. Okay, so let's think about. I'm gonna try to go back to an earlier question. Why aren't the voting registration programs, and this is a continuation of the end of our last session perhaps, why aren't the voting registration programs used by H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael utilized in areas where Black people are a numerical majority?
I'm sorry, say that again?
It's why aren't the voting registration programs used by H. Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael utilized in areas where Black people are a numerical majority?
I mean, the easy answer for me, at least, would be that because we're not sufficiently organized. I mean, that's sort of the point that I was getting at, and I'm hoping we can get Mjiba back here, because I did want to respond to something she was saying that I don't think was probably, I don't think I made myself clear enough. But the point for me around my argument around voting is to get us to be more organized, and then any number of options are available. I mean, but that would be the primary issue for me, that we're not organized well enough to do anything as a block other than be herded very, propagandistically into supporting the Democratic Party. So that's the only thing we seem to be doing is sort of a unified block at this point. And that's why we're not able to think along those kinds of lines that about how to use the vote differently. And that's sort of my whole interest in this whole conversation, whether people agree exactly with what I'm advocating or not. And I don't even know if I fully agree with it. I'm just saying that I don't even know if I fully agree with my own argument. I'm just saying that we have to be thinking differently about how we engage the vote, other than this every 4 years we vote blue no matter who.
Right. Mjiba and Kwasi are on, by the way.
Okay, well, let me. Okay, then let me.
They're not in the green room, but they're definitely logged in.
Okay, then let me bring them on. There's Kwasi and Mjiba.
Also, I want to bring up another question while you're doing that.
Okay.
One of our community members wants you to speak to how the voting on the local or national levels, down ballot, will change or not change the state-sanctioned murders of Black people, particularly of Black men. See the murder of Walter Wallace in Philly. How will voting at the local or national levels change or not change this phenomenon?
I don't think it won't change anything, because our current voting patterns vote for the two dominant parties that have invested interest in not changing anything. So that's what I'm saying. So like when people bring up the federal or Supreme Court judges, they keep leaving out so many other things, never mind all the other issues I raised earlier, but they keep leaving out the fact, for instance, that the Democratic Party keeps supporting Republican nominees and right-wing judges. I mean, when Biden was in the Senate before, he supported Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia. The Democratic Party just sat by and didn't do anything. There are many things they could have done. They promoted the myth that they didn't have the votes, but there's so many things they could have done to obstruct this process. But they just sat by and let the Republicans get another Supreme Court justice on there. So this idea that if we vote for the Democratic Party, we'll somehow get something better is part of the mythology I'm trying to help break. When it comes down to something more severe, like the very need politically and ideologically for the police to do what they do vis-a-vis Black people, that's not going to change by voting for these parties. And that's why I'm saying, if we're running our own candidates and our own parties and our own blocks with our own platforms, at least the vote will be headed in the right direction, even if that ultimately is an insufficient part of the process itself.
Can I jump in here also?
Please, of course.
Thank you. I want to you this question about voting and changing laws and addressing or the call to defund the police, or voting for people who are somehow going to hold the police responsible for killing unarmed African men and women and Latinos and Asians and whatnot. I mean, the police are here, and military, to protect the state and private property. And you and I don't look like the state or private property. And so when you, and again, I'm sorry to be always kind of like taking it out of the US, but I'm thinking about the Lekki massacre in Nigeria that just happened last week, where, the military indiscriminately opened fire on protesters, right? In pitch black. The state turned off the lights, turned off the street lights, boom. The protesters are singing the Nigerian national anthem, and the military opens fire on peaceful protesters. And so I'm suggesting this to say that the police and the military in any space is about protecting the state and private property. So to believe somehow that voting in Biden or the woman in Minnesota or anyone else is going to be able to do anything other than small reform is not looking at the entire picture of voting in America. So let's not think that this Black Lives Matter movement with George Floyd and Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin and all, this didn't just start. And there have been people that have been calling for the destabilization of the police, defunding of the police, our Black men, our Black women shouldn't be killed in DC. Why do you think the Prince George's police are called the PG Pigs? They're not called the PG Pigs because people want to eat pork. They're called the PG Pigs because of the amount of police violence against the community. And in Prince George's County, are there not African people who look like you and me, executives in power, elected officials? So how do you elect somebody in a system that is corrupt and expect that they are, even if they're well-meaning, expect that they somehow are not also going to be corrupt? Because to get into the system, one has to be corrupt. It's like you can't be like, hey, I'm going to go rob a bank with all people who don't know how to rob banks. You bring somebody who's trained in bank robbing. You don't go with somebody who just woke up yesterday and was stealing $25 dresses. You bring a bank robber because they have experience, and you will only allow someone who has experience in robbing banks on your bank robbing crew. The same thing goes for electoral politics.
Iyelli or Kwasi, do you want to respond to this? Because I know Mjiba asked that we get to this question on Latin and Black culture, which I'm happy to get to next. But before we do either of you want to?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay. All right, well, let's get to this question then. Is Latin culture a Black concern? Who would like to start with that? Mjiba, I'm assuming you wanted to start, or Iyelli, since you haven't had a chance to really get in, you want to start?
Yeah, I think we have to really be clear on our definition of Latin culture. People of African descent in so-called Latin American countries are very clear, increasingly clear about the distinction between Latin culture, which is really like a form of white supremacy, and this desperate clutching for some sort of Greco-Roman origins of the Spanish and Portuguese colonizers of these regions. So the Afrodescendientes, or the Afro-Latinos, or the Afro whomever, I think that there's a very different and very distinct conversation that needs to be had, because they have racial groupings down there in those parts, just like we do here. I think sometimes we forget that. So people of African descent, our issues are our issues, and they are of concern. They should be concerned, of concern to all of us. I think that, again, there's a distinction that needs to be drawn. If you're a white Latinx, you're not someone I'm worried about, because they often vote like white people. And I think there's some truth to that statement. I was just reading a statement that popped up in the comments.
No, that's very real, because that's one of the big concerns happening right now as people try to assess the Latin American vote now, that if, Cubans vote in Florida vote very differently than Chicanos in California, than Puerto Ricans in New York, and Afro-descended populations within those communities vote differently too. So they're having a lot of trouble assessing that. Mjiba, did you want to? Oh no, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
I did want to add, though, that I think it behooves African people to keep an eye on indigenous issues within Latin America too, because a lot of those issues are tied to land rights and environmental justice, which impacts people of African descent in these countries in similar ways, not exactly the same, but in similar ways as the indigenous populations. And so I won't say that this is an easy collaboration, but I will say that the progress of indigenous rights has everything to do with and has a direct impact on the living conditions of African people in these countries as well. So.
Yeah. So let me just say this. Two things. One, I think when we distinguish between, first of all, there's nuances to African culture, right? Where you were born, where you found yourself, your location, what language you speak. I mean, there's a lot of different things. How close or far you are to the continent really dictates your culture. But I think if we're talking about political blocks, we have to look beyond the differences and look at the similarities, right? And I think we can't confuse ourselves. America received the least amount of enslaved Africans. Okay, let's not be clear about that. If we want to think about African people and oppression and who suffered under the slavery, specifically the transatlantic slave trade and the system of slavery, In Brazil, the average age of enslaved Africans was 20. 20, my friends. So when we think through and we look at the culture in which we as African people exhibit or live through, because culture is a lived experience, we recognize that it's going to manifest itself differently, but that doesn't mean that we don't have concerns about Afro-Latinos, right? That doesn't mean that we don't have concerns about what's happening in Brazil, but more important to all of that, this came up as a result of me talking about Cuba and Bolivia. Let's talk about Cuba. Let's talk about Cuba that takes African Americans, if we want to call quote unquote African Americans, to Cuba and trains them in their medical school for free and sends them back to their community only to do what? Serve the community. This is the same Cuba that came and fought in Angola for liberation and South Africa in the Battle of Punta Cana Vara, I believe is the name. And the first person who died was a Cuban. This is the same Cuba during Katrina when our quote-unquote African-American sisters and brothers were floating down the street dead. Called George Bush and said, George Bush, we can send medical personnel immediately. And George Bush said, I do not want this. More importantly, when you start talking about Latinos and African Americans, and we don't have the same culture, let's not forget that people of African descent who live in the US, regardless of whether the historic diaspora, the first or second generation diaspora, oftentimes they are shot by the police just like you or me. Do you think that a police officer is going to see an African Cuban and say, excuse me, are you an African American or are you a Cuban? Do you think that Amadou Diallo, who was shot 90 some times in New York, was shot because he happened to not be an African? And so I'm saying all that to say I'm not down on the system who said this, because certainly there are nuances, right, to the different cultures and the different elements and struggles in which we face. But that doesn't mean that we cannot find the similarities. And also, specifically when you're talking about America, there are plenty of similarities. One, culturally, and then two, I think the other issue that we have is that quote unquote African American culture has been so immersed with American culture that we cannot even identify the Africanness of it. But culture out of Bolivia and Venezuela and Cuba and other spaces still has elements and tenements of African culture very visible, right? So that's how come we think that we're so different. And lastly, let me just say this lastly. This is the same game that America has played for generations of pitting quote unquote Americans or historic Africans against other African people, because somehow immigrants are taking your jobs. Best believe the jobs aren't there. Ain't nobody coming and taking your jobs. The jobs are not there.
Brother Kwasi, I'd like to give you a chance to answer this, because I'm also thinking, you coming or spending at least a lot of time in your life coming up in New York City, the very Pan-African Mecca that produced hip hop that has influenced many of us, at least. Sorry?
That comes from Jamaica.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. That the hip hop that we associate coming out of the Pan-African experience in New York came out of the Caribbean, came out of Jamaica, came out of Latin America, had heavy influences from the diaspora. So what are we talking about when we're talking about Latin culture versus Black culture, et cetera, and so forth?
Well, excuse me, before you go, can I just contest that we're speaking about came out of Africa by way of Jamaica and other spaces? That's just my thing. Sorry.
Fair enough.
Kwasi, I'm not trying to put you down.
Sure thing. If the question is about, this thing called Latin culture, which actually it isn't Latin at all. And I have spent time in South America, and particularly in Brazil, in Bahia, and in Goiás, and in Rio, or Rio in English. And so okay, I'll put it this way. What we're talking about is really a non-issue, but there's a distinction between, and culture is very slippery to define, so I won't try to define it. But what I am going to say is that there's a difference between a social structure and the people who live within that social structure, whose ideas about themselves, their understandings are at odds. And so let me just explode this myth, since we're myth busting tonight. There's also a thing called Latin culture. The Spanish and the Portuguese, especially, because I've been working on the Portuguese Empire for a number of years, and I read Portuguese, I speak it decently. And there's nothing pure about the idea of Latin culture. A third of Spanish, formerly Castile, and Portuguese, which come from the same cutting block, are Arabic. Right? Arabic. Look at all the al in the word, including algebra. Right? So there's nothing pure or even Western European about that. And of course, it's worth mentioning for those of us who may be unfamiliar that, this place called Iberia, Spain and Portugal today, was very much inundated with African peoples and, of course, with Arab and African Muslim conquerors for 800 years. And so much of what we attribute to Latin culture is not that. It's almost like the same for so-called Western culture, which is actually a Western civilization, which is actually an oxymoron, right? There's nothing Western about civilization. So all that said is to say that, there's nothing really distinct or unique or pure about the thing called Latin culture. Much of it is wrapped up into conquest, into the Arab and African, influence there. In fact, in Lisbon in the 16th century, 20% of that population were African. And so, when we think, therefore, about what arrives in the Americas, what we have, therefore, is really a social construction, a political construction, as Jared would say, propaganda, right? That the idea that there's a thing called Latin culture, right? That is Spanish and Portuguese in origin, which is fiction. That is then hoisted upon the people that are there of African ancestry. And so while there are African peoples who speak Spanish, we assume that their Spanish speaking is a synonym for their identity, right? And what I'm saying is that their speech in Spanish and their lives lived in these former Spanish colonies or Portuguese colonies is simply a social context. But for the people, if anyone been to Colombia and been to Choco there, you think you're in the Bronx or in Brooklyn. I kid you not. If you go to favelas in Bahia, particularly in Salvador de Bahia, you think you're in Nigeria or you're in Angola. And it's not just about a feeling or an aesthetic. I mean, I'm talking about there's a distinction we have to draw between peoplehood and their self-understanding and the social political context in which they live in. And so Brazil presents itself as a so-called racial democracy, another fiction, by which everyone is just Portuguese, and that's another fiction. But underneath that layer of facade, in terms of, we're thinking about voting now, what's being played is really how the social and political context is reframing how people think about themselves, right? So people being compelled or seduced to think about themselves as Hispanic, right? If you look at the U.S. Census, how they categorize people is very revealing. Because Hispanic is authored as its own unique category. They're non-race. They're racial non-race, according to U.S. Census, right? Which means you can be white and Hispanic, or you can be not white and Hispanic, right? And that's purposeful, because if you look at the definition of white according to the U.S. Census, and anyone can go on Google it or any search engine do that now, that white includes people from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. How do these people become white? That's a political construct, right? So I'm saying the same thing for Hispanic. That's a political construct, not a construct about people and their self-representation, right? And I think we got to distinguish the two when you think about voting, because what's being hoisted upon these, Latinx or whatever else construction you want to have is that they are being compelled or seduced to vote in terms of blocks based on the fiction that they are Hispanic, that they are, part of this category that is a social and political construct, not based on how they see themselves, what they cook in their kitchen or what they do, at home in their communities, whether it's Bamba or it's Merengue, whatever it is that they do in terms of their peoplehood is not on the ballot. What's on the ballot is that they have to subscribe to, just like African Americans have to subscribe to the Democratic Party, they have to subscribe to the idea of Hispanic, and which means it obliterates any other sensory perception of who they are in terms of lived experience.
All I have to say in addition is there's nothing European about salsa. That's some funky whatever. So, okay. So we have a brother Omawale wants to come on and ask a question. So we would need one of our panelists to step down for a few minutes to bring him on. You're volunteering, Iyelli? Okay. So Dr. Ichile will slide back and we'll bring brother Omawale up, I believe, to ask a question about voting blocks. And then we'll get back to the rest of the conversation. In fact, while I do that, let me get you all to let me pull up another question while I take this second here. Just real quick, Elise is asking, what do you say to people who insist that preventing fascism is important enough to vote for less evil, at least this upcoming election? I think that's a very good question. Either one of you want to jump out there real quick and tackle that?
Sure, and I'll keep our time in mind. So the short answer is that whatever is considered evil is evil. And so there can't be in other words, there's no lesser or greater truth. The truth is the truth. There's no lesser or greater fact. The fact is the fact. And therefore, by that logic, evil is evil. And so I think an intentional, sort of non-vote or nod is as healthy as other options to choosing between the two.
Mjiba?
Yeah, and I think that I was just looking at fascism, so I know exactly what fascism is. To make sure before I speak out of turn, fascism is a form of far right authoritarian. It's an authoritarian regime, right? It suppresses opposition and has a strong regimentation of society and the economy, which came to prominence in the early 20th century. I'm not really sure if living under Democrats isn't a fascist state. It just maybe seems more like a fascist, less of a fascist state. It's not like a Hitler killing people fascist state. But if you're economically, politically, and socially repressed, I would suggest that that's fascism, right? But I think the other, and it's about an it's about a question of a far right authoritarian rule. So is the police killing African people because they're Africans or they think that they pose a threat? Is that not far right authoritarian? I mean, that is to me. So to me, I don't know that the U.S. has ever not been a fascist state. Is what I'm suggesting.
For me, very quickly, George Jackson identified this as a fascist state 50 years ago. I agree with him. So this is nothing new to me. The lesser of evils argument is part of the trope propaganda canard set of tactics to get us to never leave that intellectual or ideological plantation. And it's the lesser of evil voting that got us not only the corporate Obama who sold us pipe dreams, but then got us something worse after that. And after Biden, I predict we'll get something worse than even Trump. As people follow that pattern. All right, but anyway, Brother Omawale, we appreciate you stepping up, and you wanted to bring a question to the group. Welcome, and good evening. Welcome. Thanks.
Please, can everybody hear me?
You're low, a little low. I need to boost.
Can you hear me now?
There you go. Yep.
All right, I had to turn off my Bluetooth. Well, first and foremost, peace to Sister Mjiba, or Dr. Mjiba, Dr. Kwasi, and Dr. Ball. I hope I didn't butcher your name too bad. I don't know if the J is silent or the M is silent, but I do apologize in advance. But no, my question, I was more so questioning, the validity or merit and the approach of trying to develop a voter bloc, within the U.S. To engage this particular, electoral system, because I would argue that we are too politically different to actually ever attain that unity. In fact, one of the questions that I'm looking to raise this weekend during the Black Power roundtable discussion is, can a Black united front between integrationists and nationalists be maintained, in this current political environment? Because what we saw, with Malcolm's request that when we come together, that we, subdue our political and ideological differences and just align on the fact that we are Black. And many of the nationalists looking to call the integrationists and the conservatives to the table, what we saw occur over the past 50 years is that the integrationists and the conservatives have pretty much isolated the nationalists from the discussion. So my question would be, like, what's the path towards developing some type of political bloc? Because I'm arguing that I don't see it as a possibility. And I know that this particular study isn't one that a lot of us like to reference due to some of the flaws in it. But when we look at Gunnar Myrdal's study of American Dilemma, there were plenty of flaws, a lot of racism that was baked into that study. But one of the things that he pointed out in his analysis of our ability to engage the system as a bloc was, A, we are too politically different, and B, you just have a wide, what's the word I'm looking for? A significant store of Black bodies who are willing to sell out for, pennies on a dollar. So if that's the case, how do we ever, achieve such a bloc to engage with the system in a way that would change the status quo and would essentially afford us some power? That's my question.
Right on. Thank you very much. So just very quickly, and Brother Omawale, forgive this. I'm going to send you back off screen so we can bring Iyelli back up because we can only have 4 at a time. I appreciate that, though. Thank you very much for the question and coming on screen to ask it. My quick answer would be, first of all, I fully get the critique, but my argument is simply that if people are going to engage electoral politics, then the argument, I think, needs to be that we have to have our own platform and process to engage. And just as people, to your point about crossing these boundaries, just as so many Black voters are willing to forego all of those other issues that I talked about in favor of something lesser than whatever, or maybe the issue of judges, or maybe the issue of abortion, or maybe the issue of gay rights, whatever the one issue might be, that I'm saying we would need to have people be willing to forego a series of issues so that we can coalesce around a group of others. So to the extent that nationalists and integrationists may be able to all agree that we don't want war, we want universal health care. I mean, 2/3 white or Black, 2/3 of the country, every poll, 80%. Actually, 87% in a poll I just saw last week of across races said they want universal health care. So at least 80 to 75 to 80% across racial lines say they want that. So I'm assuming a huge Black bloc wants that. A huge Black bloc across racial lines would want an end to police violence, an end to war, universal health care, job improvement, maybe a universal basic income, student loan forgiveness, those kind of issues. And if we put those on an actual platform, then we'll already see that the two parties that exist can't be used to even get that stuff. So that's the only thing. And again, I'm also advocating that as a Malcolm X voter, the argument is that this is just one part of a long set of things that we need to be engaged in. So I even went too long as host. Kwasi, you want to go first on this one, and I'll bring Sister Iyelli back up, and you all can go ahead and go.
Sure thing. It's important, I think, to at least bring up what is sort of ironic in that Jared and the brother Omawale that were here, the kind of intentional and really strategic approach to voting, if people are going to do that, with the end not being voting, right? Meaning the end is not to vote and feel good about your emotional vote. That the irony is that a lot of that kind of widening of sort of African, and quote unquote African/Black political options was more possible in the 19th century during the Negro Convention movement. We have to remember that, which of course it seems a long time ago, but it wasn't long ago that before the Black Power conferences in the 1960s and 70s, in a period that I've studied along with other people, which itself brought together those factions, right? The people that could be brought under the tent, of integrationist nationalism, which I think is also useless terms anyway, because most people, as you say, regardless of their political stripe and affiliation, do value healthcare, do value healthy and whole families and communities. And so there's some things that cut across those silly lines. But obviously, that's part of the sort of, literature in terms of historical propaganda to put people into these silos so that they can beat each other's throats. So if you think about it, the National Negro Conference movement brought people together that were, wide apart, in a number of ways. People had on the table repatriation, right? People had on the table reparations, right? Remember Colley House and Dickerson of the Mutual Aid Society pension movement? That was on the table. This is the 19th century, folks. I'm saying those people who we literally and figuratively cast as Negroes, they had it right, meaning there's a national movement of people coming together to debate the fate of the quote unquote race.
They almost chose war. I'm sorry to interrupt. They almost chose war.
It's so ironic, and this speaks to also our historical literacy, right? And you talked about ideological literacy, but historical literacy, that these people were more revolutionary in terms of what's on the table. And I think the folks who join us in this community conversation, to be clear that, the problem is that we've had a narrowing of the political options rather than a widening. And that narrowing puts us into this ultimatum of vote or die. And so I'm saying that a lot of our modeling inspiration, minus in a particular tweaking or modification, is actually found in the 19th century, where people are literally thinking about, on the heels of the same kind of conditions, civil war, mass incarceration, convict labor. I mean, folks being shot in the streets, being hung, right, on cobbler trees and everywhere else. We're dealing with thematically the same kinds of issues. And the way that people responded was, hey, let's come together. The challenge for us is the actual coming to a place to widening that political spectrum. I don't know how we do that, but I'm saying if we want to look to a place to make that happen, we have the precedent. The matter, I think, right now is the pragmatics of how to do that, giving the narrowing, and as Jared pointed out so well, the insatiable propagandizing of people's imagination that is so limited in scope. It's like a Twitter feed where it's so many characters people are allowed to think, right? And I think that narrowing is what we have to push back against by having forums like this to say, hey, there's another imaginable, African-based features that is there, that is not beyond the realm of simply, being seduced to vote or die.
I just want to.
Yeah, and you know what?
I just want to be mindful. We have about 20 minutes left in our proposed time, and we have several questions. And I just want to quickly, if Brother Garrick wants to come on camera, I want to get to his question next. About the courts and the judges. If he wants to come on camera, please let us know. Otherwise, I'll do the best to relay his question or set of questions. Sorry, sister. Go ahead.
Thank you. No problem. Thank you very much. That was a very good time check. No, I just, honestly, like I don't think that in this day and age or in this America that this block voting thing will manifest the way we want it to. But I also I agree both with Jared and Kwasi that I don't think that we're as far apart politically as we think we are, because I think we lack political education. And let me give you an example. Last year, right here in Ghana, 2019, we had the year of return. Everybody traipsed over to Ghana. Everyone was down with Ghana, right? Can you imagine the Congressional Black Caucus traipsed up in here with like a delegation of like 20, 30 people talking about Africa's home? The Congressional Black Caucus? I mean, come on. These folks are the farthest away from identifying Africa as home than anybody that I know. And they were able to see the connection, right? Even if it was just a political point, see the connection that Africa's home. So what I'm suggesting is, once we begin to peel back sort of the layers of our ideology, which are imposed by American capitalism, and the U.S. imperialist system and what is our actual ideology, we might find some more similarities. But the problem is we're not having honest conversations about that about the very fact that what we believe may not be necessarily what we believe. I'm not trying to be like the Manchurian candidate and none of that, but that's the reality. The reality is that we're guided by ideology that has been ingrained in us and given to us and taught to us through the formal and informal sector, and is reinforced through electoral politics, right? And once we begin to dice, and I would suggest that even folks in the Congressional Black Caucus, for example, would begin to have conversations about reparations, about repatriation, about healthcare, about all of these issues, even if we don't agree with them politically on everything. Again, I think it's a pipe dream in this current America, but I also believe that we're not as far apart politically as we think we are.
Right on. Let's Brother Garrick, forgive me if I'm not saying Garrick Faria. I know on Twitter we've had a couple of exchanges with Dr. Carr about this issue of federal judges and appointments. And I just added to the question, your comment here, that so for the no vote community, at least pay attention to these consolidated cases. Bronovich versus DNC, Arizona Republican Party versus DNC, to be heard by SCOTUS in 2021. If they rule the way expected, VRA 65, the Voting Rights Act of 65, will be rendered totally toothless in a short time. I think this approach generally characterizes what Brother Garrick and others have been at least saying a lot in general, and I've certainly seen the exchange on Twitter as a response to my and other people's arguments about why we shouldn't be voting for the Democratic Party, with the idea, again, that the Voting Rights Act is coming under attack, or civil rights protections are coming under attack. Then we need to protect. Here. Let me. Oh wait, who? Can I ask somebody to step off the panel so we can bring him up real quick? Is there anybody who's? Okay, thank you, Brother Kwasi. Let me get Brother Garrick up here, and we can quickly try to address this question. And maybe he can even make the point better than I've done for him. Yes, I want to invite him on screen. For some reason that's not happening though. But anyway, do either of you want to get started on this question of protecting these rights and why we have to support the Democratic Party to protect some of these federal court appointments and Supreme Court appointments?
I mean, Jared, I can Jared, he's on. He just says he's on a different screen. He's on like Todd.
Oh, well, brother, go ahead. I don't see you, but go ahead and maybe we can hear you. I don't see you. I'm not sure what's going on.
Can you speak?
Don't hear him either.
There's something up in the right-hand corner that's green that says control your mic and camera. If you see that, click that. That'll help you.
Because when I'm seeing I'm seeing him as invited but not on, and then rejected. So I'm re-inviting. But anyway, let me get you, because I don't want to lose all the time that we have. It's saying rejected for some reason. He's from my end, it's reading as though he's rejecting the invitation. I don't know that that's the case, but this idea that we need to protect, like these, when I was reading these arguments on Twitter, my response was always, these are very sort of esoteric, deep in the weeds legal cases that may ultimately have some impact, but certainly not to the extent that all of these other issues impact Black people's lives. Again, war, healthcare, student debt, joblessness, income versus, wealth discrepancies, policing, whistleblower protections. I mean, on and on and on. I mean, it's, when I served in the military, that's the only, U.S. institution that's a majority so-called minority, because they said we're all out there and getting sent to war. That is a negative impact by my estimation. I didn't enjoy that. I didn't enjoy that. But when we're asked to ignore all of that and go all the way, say we got to protect these core, how do you respond? What do you all think about that?
Well, I mean, I just have a couple questions. I see in the chat, the brother says, job creation, policing or policing, ability to peacefully assemble. 3 questions. What jobs are created through voting? First question. I mean, are there millions of jobs created through voting? Are jobs equally distributed through voting? Are jobs, are African people not being disenfranchised and not giving access to these jobs? Are they livable wage, right? Are you going to tell me that my job is picking strawberries? Am I supposed to be happy with that? I know in 2008 and I know a lot of people say, oh, Obama came in and he just kind of, he just inherited this. But in 2008, a lot of African people there was predatory lending, and African people were losing their homes at exorbitant rates, losing their jobs, becoming homeless. I don't know necessarily that voting helped or stopped that. In regards to peacefully assembling, I mean, weren't people peacefully assembling before 65? And they were still getting beat down and shot and also attacked by dogs? Oh, wait a minute. Didn't somebody peacefully assemble and just get killed in Philly today? Didn't somebody peacefully assemble in where is this place? Oregon, and unmarked, notifiable military style Blackwater folks running up on protesters, grabbing them up in the street, putting them in vans and driving away? I don't know about peaceful assembly. That's my opinion.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say, but I think that there's also like a really important distinction to be drawn between de jure and de facto, and just, we cling to these laws and we put a lot of faith in this legislation that, and we kind of sometimes move away from like the very real ways in which these laws are differentially enforced and differentially offered. The privileges are not extended equally to everyone in our society, and really the historical background, which lets us know that voting isn't how we get most of those things. Most of those things are a result of a lot of other types of pressure that were put on the leadership in our country. And the last little thing I wanted to note was just to reiterate the idea that we are facing some of the same circumstances as our ancestors of 100 years ago or 120 years ago. But what I feel like is happening now is like propagandized paranoia and panic. And I think back then there was more of a unified urgency. And you know what I mean? Like, I think we're just kind of like scrambling around here. And I think we're so busy, feeling this sense of panic, thinking that we're in this unique time with this unique character in the White House, that we're really not thinking about the common ground that we have. Like to the point that was made by Jared and Mjiba and Kwasi earlier, we have so many issues that the majority of us could agree on, but we have allowed our political vision to be so narrowed. I really want to raise the question, and I hope we can talk for 2 minutes at least about the question of African sovereignty. Like, that word alone, sovereignty, has been it's almost taboo to talk about that, because we're so locked into this nation state idea of ourselves. Pan-Africanism is almost, a dirty word in some circles, to really think of ourselves as a global group of people. So again, the expanding of our vision is really like a serious, critical need that we have to meet if we're going to move in any direction. If any of these things, voting, protesting, any of that stuff is to be effective for us.
Kwasi, before you go, before I forget, the only thing that to this point that I've been advocating to Brother Garrick, to Dr. Carr, to others who are making this point online, that I've been asking for is the essay, the article I quoted in my essay from Samuel Moyne. Here is a law professor outlining a legal argument explaining why a focus on Supreme Court and federal judges is not worth the effort and has never been of much value to so-called minorities in this country. What I'm asking for those who are making these arguments is to point me to, or for them to create themselves, the article or essay that explains in detail this legal argument and shows people like me how all the focus on the federal courts as almost the singular voting issue has an impact in a way that measures up against all these others, because I still don't see it. And I admit a frustration at that argument never really being made as people keep browbeating me and others over judges. Brother Kwasi.
Well, sure. That one is pretty simple, of course, because this is not a matter of evidence, really. In fact, much of though this discussion is valuable, is not that we lack evidence, right? We don't. So this is not an argument, against or about the nation state or about, the U.S. empire. The evidence is pretty clear. Even if you don't want to see it, it's pretty clear. When you have rich white folks in New York that are fleeing and are talking about Canada as their homeland, the evidence is clear and is real. There are already people making their permanent vacation plans, come next Tuesday or Tuesday afternoon or Tuesday night, depending upon whenever they get the results. And so I think these matters, again, boil down to two things, which is going to be crucial for us, the peoples of the African world, is belief and power. I don't believe in believing, but I do know, particularly as someone who studies, history of the world, that people believe in this thing. And I think this is at this sort of substrata level, Jared, that you're referring to. People believe, and they want to believe. They want to believe this thing called democracy will work. In fact, I heard the late Manning Marable, before he passed away, a very proponent of this idea of social, democratic, whatever, socialism mixed with democracy. And he said, sort of almost like a last word, a will and testament, that only if they give the Constitution a chance to work, right? As if that's going to solve everything. So, but I'm saying that flows from a belief. People want to believe that this thing is going to work. It's like that, that person who has been, done wrong by that pedophilic, uncle or aunt. They want to believe that there's something better around the corner. They want to believe that the police won't shoot us as much. They want to believe, that healthcare is somewhere around the corner. They want to believe, that these geriatrics who are running this country and this world, no offense to elderly people, but these are people that are probably halfway, some form of senility that we entrust, with this. And I think for people of the African world, this is really a function of really trying to, think about what's at stake. And again, my thing is that it has to be about detoxing this belief, this attachment to something that the evidence is in overwhelming favor that it doesn't work. But it's the belief that keeps us tethered to, this thing called voting, this thing called democracy, this thing called the nation state, this thing called, French colonialism wasn't that bad. It keeps us, is belief. And then what makes that belief holds is the threat of real or imagined coercive power. People are scared.
Listen, I see it's coming up at
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say go ahead. Go ahead. Go. No,
I'll be very brief. I just want to jump in here because I just wanted to make 2 points. One, I am saddened that people have to live under these repressive sort of conditions of what's happening now. I'm sorry that people have to live under these conditions. But let's also remind ourselves that our ancestors have had to live under even more intense conditions. And our ancestors, under intense conditions, organized for their freedom. I would suggest, and if you look at the history of organizing in the African world, the Pan-African world, the U.S. as a case study, that the most organizing for liberation happened under repressive conditions. I'm not suggesting that one needs to be repressed, but I am suggesting that if we know that something is not correct, for us to sit back and think that we're equal, many more of our people will die. And it's a really anti-people's position that we're taking because we want to live comfortably. Because even under Obama, many of our people didn't live comfortably. That's all.
Most didn't. He's chilling in a $40 million or 40-acre estate up in Martha's Vineyard right now. So listen, we didn't get to everything. I know we're at the end of our time here. I want to ask everybody to give a 60-second closing statement. And for mine, I only want to remind everybody, as I put in the chat, the 2014 Princeton University study that I think proved, as they argue, we are an oligarchy, not a democracy. And they showed that through a 25 or 30-year track record of tracing the vote, that if the most elite did not support it, nothing passed. So that's one point that I would want to make. And then to Brother Garrick's point that he just put in the chat, that it's elected officials that set job policy. I agree, but that's the point why it's the Democratic Party that has been playing a role in preventing this process that led the Economic Policy Institute to conclude that Black people are in a quote unquote permanent recession, regardless of party, regardless of how well the economy is so-called doing. We need other officials to be elected if we want different kinds of job policy. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to those on camera. Brother Todd, we can bring you on for one last comment in just a minute. But Sister Iyelli, let me let you go first with your concluding comment.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Pardon me, I am really tired. This has been a long couple of days, but I think what I came into the discussion with was the question about how we as African people will reckon with each other on November 4th. After the election happens, I think we need to create some sort of plan moving forward to try to reach the verve of our ancestors around politics, expand our political vision, our political will, put some things back into our repertoire. So to speak. I think we need to help each other do some more studying and think also very seriously about self-defense. I mean, practical, in your home self-defense. We haven't really been taking that real possibility seriously, but as a historian and as someone who watches patterns, I think we need to do way more than vote. We need to think about the morning after, the months after, once all the votes are counted, and how our enemies in this society and other societies respond when things don't go their way, and also the permissive atmosphere that can be created when things do go their way. That's all I got.
Hey, forgive me, but what has two thumbs and agrees with that? Brother Kwasi, you want to jump in?
Sure. This will be extremely brief. What Iyelli said.
Word up.
Okay. I have two things. Democracy does not equal power. Voting does not equal democracy. And when one wakes up on December 5th and we see in the news that another African man has been killed and Joe Biden has been elected, what then will we say about the good old democracy of America?
Well, to his request, since we're running out of time, Dr. Burroughs has said all those comments about imagination can stand for his final words. So we'll leave it there. I want to thank my Blacklash Collective comrades and colleagues here. I definitely want to thank everybody for joining us out there in the world. Please do contact us at blacklashcollective@gmail.com and sign up. Well, as all of you would have had to sign up to be here tonight, stay tuned. You'll be contacted when we have our next event. Thanks, everybody. As Fred Hampton used to say,
November 25th, which is November 25th. Sorry, yes.
November 25th is the next one, and you will be hearing more about that in the coming weeks. And good luck surviving this election and everything else. And as Fred Hampton used to say, peace to you if we are willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and thanks again. Good night, everybody.
Forward ever.
or whatever. Ready for the revolution. Let's get them all in. Free the land, free the political prisoners.
Ready for revolution. Exactly.
All right, people. Take care.
Take care.
Forward. Good night.